Now, sometimes there are people who, well, viewers, in fact, who ask me, okay, so Jung says that NI dominance, the introverted intuitive in Jung's own words, enjoys more privileged access to the unconscious than other people, and than the average person, people who have another dominant function. And this is something that a lot of Jungians take for granted, that in our descriptions and self-descriptions as NI dominance we tend to take for granted because we experience it, and other people often take it for granted. But actually this is a good question, the question of why is it the case that NI dominants have this quote-unquote privileged access to the dynamics of the unconscious, what I like to call in my writing, and this is also something that will transpire in my NI book to come out hopefully next year, a keener sensitivity to the dynamics of the unconscious. I prefer the idea of a keener sensitivity over privileged access. Privileged access sounds kind of philosophical, epistemological, and it sounds like in some way NI dominants are superior to like other types when it comes to the unconscious and knowing the unconscious and tracing the structure and dynamics of the unconscious. I prefer to think of it as a keener sensitivity. It's like anyone in principle can do it, but there is the NI dominant seems particularly sensitive to these dynamics and how they interact with everyday behavior, being in the world, everyday affairs, conscious thoughts. A piece of evidence, it's not 100% bulletproof evidence, but it is still evidence that NI has this sensitivity, is that a lot of great and famous psychoanalysts were in fact NI dominant. With Freud, it's a complicated issue. Some people think he was SI dominant, possible. Other people think he used NI, possible as well. But I would say that in the case of Carl Jung, in the case of Jacques Lacan, in the case of Melanie Klein, at the very least, these three figures, towering figures in the history of 20th century analysis, they were all NI dominants. So it should tell you something about the keener sensitivity. You can also mention the example of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, not a psychoanalyst, but definitely a precursor of psychoanalysis, influenced Freud, influenced Jung, as is well known. And Nietzsche was also first of all, he was an NI dominant, but he was also very keenly sensitive to these dynamics. He didn't talk about these dynamics as unconscious dynamics as such. He used different vocabulary, in a sense more aphoristic, more intuitive vocabulary, but he was getting at the same notions. So usually people are quite happy to say empirically, in terms of pure description, and often that's kind of implicitly or explicitly based on the authority of Carl Jung, and you shouldn't give anyone too much authority without questioning things yourself. NI dominants have this keener sensitivity to the dynamics of the unconscious, but the question of why that's the case is rarely addressed. It's difficult because we're talking about the unconscious. So again, we have to be a bit psychoanalytic. We have to start using a vocabulary that is not the vocabulary of transparent, rational, logical science, because that's not how the unconscious is structured. Okay, but I want to tell you a bit of a story that hopefully will serve as an allegorical explanation of why I think that's the case. Now, as you know, I'm a believer in the fact that each type is structuring their experience of the world according to a fantasy PH. In fact, according to a whole web of fantasies, which are unconscious images and representations and narratives that structure their unconscious and provide, in a sense, a channel for the making meaning in the world, how your life makes sense. It's kind of always referring back to these fantasies, even if this is not conscious. The fundamental fantasy is the fantasy at the center, the fantasy that in relation to which the other fantasies are more subsidiary. So I've talked about the fantasy of repair, which I believe is a good way to capture the NI fantasy, NI dominant fantasy, the fantasy of cleansing or purification, which would be the fantasy of the TI dominant. We still need to work on, and other types, people who actually are other types would be helpful in trying to figure out what would be the prominent fantasies and core fantasies that we would see in NE dominance, in TE dominance, in FE dominance, so on. Okay. Now, the story that I want to tell is basically this. The symbolic, all right, the symbolic is not the same as the sign. Now, this is something that I've already explained in videos before. The archetypes, for example, are symbols. They're not signs. Signs are abstract. Signs are interchangeable. Signs are used to signify a particular meaning that is, so to speak, behind the sign. In this sense, most words are signs. Mathematical signs are signs. But the symbols of the unconscious, including the archetypes of the collective unconscious, are not signs in this way. They have concreteness. They are condensation of combined early experience in childhood and via the collective unconscious, the condensed life experiences of hundreds and hundreds of generations, millennia of experience, okay? And that's what makes them collective. Now, what I think is that any fundamental fantasy is structured around a core symbol, all right? And this core symbol is going to be different depending on what type you are. In fact, it's going to be different for each person, but certain core symbols will be more or less similar in the case of people with similar types. This core symbol is a nexus. It's a stitching. I think a suture or a stitching is the best way to describe it. It's an inscription in the psyche that knots together, stitches together, sutures together the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious, which, by the way, is actually necessary if the archetypes are really to have influence over our lives. They have in some way to penetrate through to the personal unconscious. Otherwise, how could they? I think they do this through this core symbol. But the core symbol has various levels of porosity. It needs to have a certain kind of porosity, a bit like a sponge. Otherwise, there would be no communication between the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. At the same time, if it is too porous, it can collapse like a collapsed dam, which would feature then an invasion, an overwhelming of the collective unconscious, or rather of the personal unconscious by the collective unconscious. This would in fact be something quite similar to the way Jung describes psychosis. Okay, so there needs to be porosity, but not too much porosity. Now, I think that in the case of the anti-dominant, the core symbol, I have proposed a kind of figure, a tracing for it, a cipher for it in my NI writing, so you will see it appear in my NI book next year, hopefully. But this symbol, I variously refer to it as the open womb, ghost of the lost mother, the open circle, broken womb, things like that. It's an incomplete Ouroboros, essentially trying to complete itself. I think this NI core symbol has the quality, compared to other core symbols, of being more porous than average. And it is this higher level of porosity, not so porous that it threatens something like psychosis in a Jungian sense, but a more highly porous quality, okay? Which means that there is just more unconscious communication between unconscious, collective unconscious and personal unconscious, right? It also means that there is more natural attraction and openness to shadow work, because the shadow is an archetype that is also kind of circling around this symbol between the collective and the personal unconscious. More porosity, more symbolic porosity, higher sensitivity to the dynamics of the collective unconscious. I think that's what defines the NI core fantasy and therefore core NI behavior in NI dominance. That was it for my story. Give me a like if you enjoyed this video, guys. Don't forget that if you want to know more about the INFJ personality and NI dominance in general, I already have written 2 books. There's one coming up, but there's the Ecstatic Soul, which is my book, my first book on the INFJ. You should get it if you haven't yet. If you want to know more about the inner world of the INFJ, this is the book to get. More about the INFJ's outer world and how to be in the world as an INFJ, given the world is tough for us a lot of the time. The Infinite Soul, and as you can see, these books go well together. They're all linked in the description box below. You should get them if you want a deep understanding. And don't forget, you can support me on Patreon. I need you more than ever. I could not do this without you. For a few bucks a month or a year, you get access to a whole library of exclusive content where I go in depth about particular topics. Last topic was NI and dystopias, usually suggested by the community on Patreon. Also access to our Discord server, interact with me every day and with the other people there. It's a lot of fun. It helps me. See you next time, guys, and thank you very much.